The shrieking of bombs raining from above, the rattle of machine gun bullets rocketing into innocent men, women, and children, tearing flesh from bone. Tortured screams echo through the air, and the mud is littered with bodies, tossed away like yesterday's garbage. Who is to blame for all of this? None other than the monsters who have led their own followers to their slaughter. Ladies and gentlemen, hark! Hark to the hellish work of our leaders. And where are the false lion hearts now? Sitting cozy in their presidential suites, sipping martinis and eating paninis. Failed leadership, and failed leadership. Greetings, esteemed judges, and worthy opponents, and the House at large. My name is Shaurya-Aditya Sircar, and I am here to strongly propose the motion which states, failed leadership is to blame for all the problems in Africa. So let's get down to defining the motion first. According to Google Dictionary, the word fail is a state or condition where a desirable outcome is not achieved, the opposite of success. Leadership is guidance by force, influence, and persuasion. Blame is a verb which declares that something or someone is responsible for a fault or action. And all means without any exceptions. So before my worthy opponents try to confuse and deceive you, allow me to clarify a few things. Because they might say that it is impossible that all the problems in Africa are caused by failed leadership. To which I definitely agree. However, the reason why these problems still persist today is due to failed leadership. Also, this motion does not specify to what extent the blame is imposed, whether it is full or partial. So regardless, the blame still falls on failed leadership. So my worthy opponents, the burden of proof falls on your hands to prove to us that failed leadership and all the problems in Africa have no connection whatsoever. So with the change in foreign policy by the Western countries, most of the African nations attained independence by the late 1960s. But 5 decades later, what do we have to show as a continent? Is it the mind-boggling corruption, or is it the endless wars and conflicts? Independence was supposed to bring peace and prosperity to our nation and continent. But what has happened? Things have been diluted, and now people have tasted the sweet money like honey and have been entranced by it. The promised democracy has been turned into a dictatorship. People have grabbed onto power for far too long. I mean, take the example of our former president of Zimbabwe, Mr. Robert Mugabe. He couched in power for an absurd 30 years, and when he left Zimbabwe in shambles. So when he was asked when he would be bidding his people farewell, his response, why? Where are my people going? Let's face it, Africa's corruption is unparalleled. It loses over $150 billion annually just to corruption. And we all know where that money is really going. Our leaders have their priorities completely wrong, because instead of leading to solve issues like unemployment and poverty, they lead their bank accounts happily to victory, while people are impoverished. Kenya, on the other hand, has devolved their government. Results? Mega corruption scandals running to a tune of 1 trillion shillings lost annually. Who is to blame for this? You? Me? No, it's failed leadership. Our leaders cannot even retain, let alone improve on what we have inherited from our colonists. So if my worthy opponents cannot see that 50 years down the line, African infrastructure and economies are still in shambles due to this failed leadership, they'll allow me to attend your respective funerals because you are about to die due to delusion. Now, as if a side dish to corruption, our leaders have completely failed in conflict resolution, leading to a gross loss of lives. I mean, they in fact sparked this conflict like civil wars, or have done a laughable amount of work in trying to stop them in a diplomatic manner. Take the example of the South Sudanese civil war. 50,000 dead, 2.3 million displaced, and all of this can be completely blamed on failed leadership. But don't relax just yet, because we are about to march into Somalia, where terrorism has spread like literal wildfire. After the collapse of the central government, there was a vacuum of power left behind. And so, terrorist groups like the Al-Shabaab and various clans formed, starting to wage war on each other. International leaders and AU tried to step in by creating AMISOM, an intervention body. But they failed. In fact, they made things worse as Al-Shabaab in retaliation launched attacks in other countries, like our own nation's Westgate attacks and Uganda's Kampala attacks. This is just a tiny example, ladies and gentlemen. So just imagine that each part of Africa today is affected by a terrorist group. Now do you see who is to blame? Now do you see the truth of the matter? Now there's a saying, ladies and gentlemen, that the captain always goes down the ship. Well, it could not be more truer for Africa, because our leaders are more than confident to sink the marvelous ship of Africa. And my worthy opponents are supporting the fact that these same leaders somehow have no connection whatsoever to our problems. And so when they do this, they allow failed leadership to be the spark that will light the fire that will blow Africa down. Thank you very much.
The quagga, gone. The Berber hartebeest, gone. The Cape lion, gone. The western black rhino, gone. All of these famous, prestigious African animals washed off his face. Why? Because our leaders can't make decisions that will effectively tackle our problems. Esteemed judges, my worthy opponents, and the House at large, my name is Tanay Malde, and I stand here to strongly propose the motion that states failed leaders are to blame for all problems in Africa. I would like to start by rebutting some points brought up by the opposing team. They said that a problem is natural disasters, and the cause is not the government, is not the leaders. Well, yes, that's true, but they can control the response time. Like if you look in Africa, it takes 45 minutes for an ambulance to reach you, and then you go to somewhere like Europe, 2 minutes. Also, they also said war is not the fault of failed leadership. Again, if the leaders had come to an agreement, war could have all been prevented. Also, they also said poverty is not a fault of failed leadership. Poverty can also be eradicated. I mean, in Africa, we're so rich with resources. We have a combined GDP of $6 trillion. You're telling me that we cannot eradicate poverty? Now on to my points. Ladies and gentlemen, 1/5 of all known African species are either endangered, critically endangered, or vulnerable. And this is because of preventable causes like pollution, habitat destruction, and poaching. You may wonder, what does this have to do with our motion of failed leaders? Everything. Aren't our leaders supposed to fix our problems? Well, our leaders in Africa are not doing anywhere near enough. Like, look at the government of Kenya as an example. They realized that there was a problem with poaching and trade of ivory. What did they do about it? They set stricter laws on poaching and trading. What happened after that? The northern white rhino still went extinct. While our leaders have tried, again, I would like to reiterate that what they have done is nowhere near enough. Still don't believe me? Allow me to bring up an interesting fact. The WWF, World Wildlife Fund, gave up on African leaders trying to solve the problem of endangered animals and took matters into their own hands. They took 200 black rhinos out of government protection into the WWF reserve. From there, in the following 9 years, the population of these rhinos prospered. They reached a population of 600. They climbed up from critically endangered to vulnerable, a massive growth. What African leaders failed to do in over 3 decades, the WWF did in 9 years. Moving on, we all know the threats of deforestation, right? Well, it seems like our leaders don't. In Congo, 1,200 square miles of forest are cut down annually in the Congo Basin. If it continues at this rate, the Congo Basin will be completely eradicated in 50 years. Now, you have every right to believe that the government is doing all they can to stop this, but you'd be surprised. Since 1980, this problem has been noticed, and since 1980, the government hasn't done a thing about it. My worthy opponents, don't you see? The face of Africa, our wildlife, our nature, is being washed away because of failed leadership. It is now a shadow of its former self, and you think that this is not because of our failed leadership. Moving on to education. Out of the top 25 countries with the lowest literacy rate, Africans occupy 19 spots on the list. Africa as a continent has an illiteracy rate of 40%. That's 480 million people that can't read and write. In a continent so rich with resources and a combined GDP of $6 trillion, how did we let this happen? Allow me to explain. Out of the billions annually that are supposed to be going towards education, 1/3 is straight up stolen, another third is also stolen, and the last third is spent trying to figure out where the other 2/3 went. This is how our leaders deceive us into paying taxes that are supposed to be going towards the country's needs, but instead they go directly into feeding the failed leadership syndrome. I mean, there are schools with no floors, walls, and ceilings, and then our failing leaders that spend millions on their lavish lifestyle every year, and yet we wonder why Africa has such a high illiteracy rate. If problems in Africa were a tree, our leaders would be the root, the soil, and the whole darn tree. Failed leadership is to blame for all problems in Africa. Thank you.
There are two ways to be fooled. One is to believe in false truth. The other is to refuse to believe the truth. My guess is that the opponents have refused to adamantly believe that the multitude of problems that Africa faces are a direct result of failed leadership. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me open your eyes to the truth that our opponents are willing to brush off like a non-issue. Good afternoon, honorable judges, my worthy opponents, and the House at large. My name is Kea Shah, and I'm here to strongly propose the motion that states that failed leadership is to blame for all the problems in Africa. But before I do, I'd like to rebut a few points made by my opponents. To continue blaming Western powers for underdeveloping Africa decades after most countries have gained independence is simply failure to take responsibility. Secondly, the foreign intervention is also a form of leadership, and what has that done? Failed. To get started, we have experienced the rise and fall of great economies in Africa, but due to failed leadership. For instance, take the case of Robert Mugabe and the Zimbabweans. Mugabe shoved aside reasoning and diplomacy and instead embraced a combative approach. This set the stage for him to become a classic dictator who destroyed the country's economy just to keep his job. Results? A broken country with zero links to the international market. The regime of Robert Mugabe, particularly the land seizures from white farmers, led to an economic downfall in the country's agricultural economy, which had formerly been Africa's strongest when Zimbabwe used to be known as the breadbasket of Africa. And this has remained to this date. This tragic loss has not been settled. Mugabe's failed leadership drove the Zimbabwean economy to hyperinflation, where the Zimbabwe dollar was not worth the very paper it was printed on. Zimbabweans overnight became poor as their savings became worthless. So the economy doesn't have a currency, and the economy runs using the South African rand and the US dollar. With leaders like him, it's obvious to see why most African countries continue to wallow in poverty and misery. Another example is the Democratic Republic of Congo, who has the potential of being one of the richest countries in the world because of its resources. Yet, due to poor leadership, it is the poorest country in the world with a per capita GDP of $450 Moving on. Africa's intra-regional trade lies well below that of other regions. And in 2016 alone, 18% of total African exports, intra-African exports, was made for the total African exports, compared to the 59 and 69% of intra-Asia and intra-Europe. Why do you think that African countries do not trade with each other? It is because we have underdeveloped infrastructure. Because all our leaders see are potential opportunities for self-gain. We have not made any progress towards infrastructure. Imagine if the pipeline dream was a highway running from Cairo to Cape Town. How many businesses do you think would thrive at this prospect? This is because the leadership have been sitting ducks, perched upon their thrones, feeding us lies of economic stability, when half these countries are trailing the world's index line. In the 60s, just when Kenya had gained independence, countries like Malaysia, Taiwan, and India were at the same level economically. So what did Kenya lack? I bet you already know the answer. Africa has generally had different leaders, but with the same results for decades. Why? Failed leadership is characterized by a culture of leaders who are served instead of serving. All the evidence to Africa's problems points directly towards failed leadership. It is time for a new breed of leadership to unleash the potential of this continent. Thank you.
The most corrupt continent on the planet. 27 out of 28 of the poorest countries lie here. 40 out of 54 of the countries have seen a coup, and 23 of them have seen at least 3 coups each. I am dumbfounded. I'm flabbergasted. Are you to blame for this? No, wait. Is God to blame? How about the dinosaurs? Sadly not, ladies and gentlemen. It is failed leadership. Good afternoon, esteemed judges, my worthy opponents, and the House at large. My name is Karan Shah, and I am here to firmly propose the motion that states failed leadership is to blame for all the problems in Africa. I'd like to refute a few points erringly brought out by the opposing team, whose arguments are just like the leadership in Africa, hiding the facts and blatantly lying to our faces. You talked about poverty not being caused by leaders. Well, you'll be interested to know that in Zimbabwe, they found a blood diamond mine where they found stones worth 800 billion pounds. That is not a slip of the tongue. And still, in Zimbabwe, we have out of every 10 people, 7 suffer from poverty. This is because of failed leadership. Where does all this money go to? I'll show you where. Right in their pockets. Moreover, you talked about natural disasters. Well, it's the response that counts. Of course, we cannot control them. In Japan, a bridge fell down and they built the whole thing in 43 hours. And still in Kenya, it takes us 3 years to build a flyover. To begin with, I will dwell on the perennial problem in Africa, tribalism. Tribalism rides on the precept that a group is superior or more important than the other. And who propagates this? Leaders. Let's take Rwanda as an instance. Who can forget the genocide where over 1 million Tutsis were killed because of the Hutus? And who propagated this? Mr. Bean? Of course not. Power-hungry leaders. We all know about the apartheid in South Africa from 1948 to 1990. Well, this was solely due to poor leadership. The leaders actually encouraged all of this. Now my worthy opponents will argue that Nelson Mandela remedied the saga. But what did his successors, Jacob Zuma and Thabo Mbeki, do? They mobilized anti-white sentiment to maintain power. And this just resulted in compound problems for the people and the continent as a whole. Because of that, what we have now is post-apartheid racism and xenophobia. Moving on, a major predicament in Africa is health and sanitation. Pandemics and epidemics are a constant, and outbreaks chuck in like daily newspaper. You see, the problem is that leaders are reactive instead of proactive. They put the cart before the horse. It's not until an epidemic becomes a national disaster that our leaders try and look for solutions. Let's take Ebola as an instance. We all remember the outbreak between 2014 and 2016, whereby 11,325 people died. So, now my worthy opponent will be wondering, what's the relevance of all this? Well, this was solely due to failed leadership. There was an article by Al Jazeera that read, Ebola in Guinea. Is government incompetence a bigger threat? Let that sink in. This was due to the fact that while the rest of the world was busy curbing this virus, leaders in Africa were still in denial. Now, we would all think that African leaders have learned from their mistakes. But, wait for it, there's been another outbreak of Ebola, this time in Congo, and already 1,000 cases have been reported. Anything done by our able leadership? Of course, waiting for the rest of the world to come and save the day again. To summarize, I would like to say that Africa is like a plane being flown by clueless pilots. The leaders have failed to guide our plane properly, be it socially, economically, politically, environmentally, you name it. Now, do you blame the passengers on board, or in this case, the people for it? Of course not. You blame the pilots. You blame the leaders. Failed leadership is to blame for all the problems in Africa. Thank you.
Wow, my worthy opponents, I think you have mistaken this debate for a stand-up comedy because everything you have said up to this point is a joke. Let me tell you why. My first speaker came up and gave us a nice recap of everything we already know, acting like a nice teleprompter in front of a president. Now you say that we elect our leaders and we don't know what they're going to do. Well, thanks. You just won the debate for us. Do you know what nepotism is? Do you know what that is? It is when leaders favor their own friends and family and relatives other than others. So that means that positions of power are given off without any elections. The citizens you talked about who are fighting for freedom and democracy, do you know who are leading them with false visions? Our leaders. South Sudan's Salva Kiir and Riek Machar told their citizens, fight for your country. But really what they were fighting for is the gold mines at the middle of the country. And you say that failed leadership is not to blame here. You are so predictable, my worthy opponents. You talk about natural factors not being the cause of failed leadership. Get those thick earbuds out of your heads, because we clearly said we agree. But I ask you now, is the Mother Nature's natural phenomenon the problem, or the consequence? The management of that consequence, the problem? Just take the example of the Middle East. Dubai, it experiences 5 sandstorms and 4 heat waves every month. And so, what happened to his economy? It's booming. But look at Africa. Droughts here and there, heat waves here and there, and the economy is failing. Who is to blame for the management? Failed leadership. My second speaker, you have just won the debate again for us. You talk about schools being available. However, do you understand that the school concentration spread in Africa is way too low? And so tell me why the UN has announced the literacy rates for African children so high. So I think we should listen to them instead of the UN, because they are more reliable. You keep blaming colonialism, but do you realize that Africa's economic and general situation was way, way better before colonialism was eradicated from this continent? Now it's way worse. And what do we have to blame for that? Failed leadership. My third speaker, you said that all problems of Africa cannot be due to failed leadership. You talked about female circumcision. But do you know who has allowed this to happen? The government. You say that our leaders have done something. they have done something. So tell me why the rape rates in Africa are so large. Tell me why the crimes against women are still so high. Again, this is due to failed leadership. Also, do you realize that majority of the religious leaders today and cults are anti-women, anti-women empowerment? You have not mentioned that at all. And so what is that again? Failed leadership. My fourth speaker, you talked about creativity being unnoticed. Talking about a really nice app on our nice iPhones, informing us on what the problems are. But what have they done? Have they done anything to these problems? Are the problems still at large? Yes, they are. And who is to blame again? Failed leadership for the 10th time in the row. You asked us, how do we know that corruption exists? Have you been living under a rock or something? Have you read the thing called a newspaper? Do you know what that is? It is not about the cause, ladies and gentlemen. It is about the blame of the management for the consequence of that cause. We have given examples like Zimbabwe, Eritrea, New Guinea, Estonia, South Africa, Rwanda. And these seem like 2 countries to you. And I know that all the countries, if we start naming them today, we will win the debate because it will be far too long naming all of the problems in those countries. We have just given you the major problems in some of these countries. Ladies and gentlemen, to surmise, we talked about the social and economic problems that have failed leadership caused. We talked about the terrorism and the insecurity and the corruption caused by failed leadership, the educational problems caused by failed leadership. And so, my worthy opponents, please know what you're talking about, and thank you.
And the best speaker was Shaurya. Okay. And of course, everybody is very eager to know the winning school. And the winning school is Oshawa. Let's walk a while. You're done. Get it also. I was interested. I am taking 1 flower.
What will I do with them if my mother?
What can I say, Mr. Mutei? The trophy is home.
Yes.
I'd just like to say thank you so much to the Oshola Academy Mombasa team, led by Mr. Muya, who's the HOD Modern Foreign Languages and Creative Arts, who in his absence obviously was seconded by our very able Mr. Eric Mutei, who took the students through the preparation, and our lead speaker who has actually achieved the award of Best Speaker in 2 debates in the semi-finals and the finals, and the parents of the students for allowing them time to participate. These finals were especially very difficult because they happened to be at a time when we're also having our exams, end of term exams. And so this win for us is proof yet again that Oshola Academy Mombasa is a home where you're able to balance your academics and co-curricular activities. And winning this yet again for the 3rd year running is just outstanding. We can only say bravo to our parents, bravo to our board for the support, and bravo to the team and the quality of students that Oshola Academy Mombasa nurtures. Asanteni sana.
I'm exhilarated that the trophy is back home again for the 3rd time. I give thanks for the support that I've received from the administration in preparing the students for the debate. I've had exceptional students who've given their very best, who've gone through long nights in preparing for their speeches and for actually even taking the corrections and the suggestions and the opinions that we've given them as their teachers. So we are happy that we are doing this and we're soaring up as ever. Thank you.
Sometimes it's difficult to come into such a place and see butterflies. I'd see people getting nerves, and it was interesting for the first time to see Jackie hold her head and think, okay, what is going to happen within the next few minutes? But all in all, it was well. We've done well, and we are hoping for more wins. I mean, today has been that one day when after every message, after another, it's a win-win. So we are doing well.
Yes.
The situation
and
is
especially
good.
when you have in the team 3 people who are doing it for the first time.
Good.
And they've never spoken before. In fact, we had one speaker who has not spoken,
Who had not
before,
spoken before.
and was doing it for the first time
Today.
this afternoon.
This afternoon, yeah.
And it was a real risk to put him as a second speaker. But I mean, the rebuttal was the game changer,
was a game changer.
I would say, for everything. And then you see clearly the emerging confidence in the learners and the essence of teamwork.
Good.
Yes, and I liked especially the issue where they had to do the rebuttals. It's on spot. Yeah, you
So-
listen, and that's where creativity comes in.
Thinking on your feet.
Thinking
probably.
on your feet and problem-solving skills.
Yeah.
Yeah, 21st century, they do come in at that particular time, and I would say it was great.
Yeah.
It was really, really great.
And that
Yes.
goes a long way to tell us that every person has something they can give in life. It doesn't matter how late you come in, just like the popcorns they say.
Yes.
You pop in at your time.
Yeah,
One
yeah,
of them
yeah.
popped earlier.
Yes.
One popped today in the afternoon and emerged one of the best speakers we've had. So
Oh yes.
bravo to
Oh,
all
yes.
of them. Bravo
Yes.
to the team. Bravo to the school. And bravo
Yes.
to everybody
The
else.
unity
who's
and
done
everything. Yeah. Thank you.
And so 2019, the trophy is home
Again.
again.
2020.
It will be
Home.
home because we believe in excellence.
Thank you.